Hello, this is Mark Sabatella from Outside Shore Music. And in this video, I'm going to talk about, it's a piece that I wrote entitled Different Worlds, and it incorporates both classical and jazz elements. But it does so in what I would consider kind of a subtle way, and I want to talk about this. Now, this is not a new piece. I wrote this quite a few years ago, and some of you have probably heard this before. But I happen to be playing at a show a few days ago and dug this piece out. Hadn't played it for a while, and just thought maybe it would be fun to share some things about it. So I'm going to play through the opening section of this, which is a fugue. It is an absolute by-the-book fugue in three voices. We have a subject in 8 bars long, and then we have an answer to that subject, in which the subject is basically transposed up a fifth with some tonal adjustments, and then we have a third voice come in with the next response. So it's absolutely in this form of a fugue, very specifically using a lot of Baroque kinds of devices, and yet there's things about it that will feel like jazz, and that's kind of what I want to talk about here. So first thing I'm going to do is apologize for if I make any little mistakes along the way, but I'm going to play it just a few bars at a time. First, I'm going to play you the subject itself, and let's talk about what about the subject itself. It's 8 bars long here. What about that maybe is a little jazzy? All right, let's go ahead and hear this first. All right. First thing I'll say is the way I played it is definitely more romantic in nature than Baroque. Would you agree? The way I kind of played it rubato. I mean, I can't say that no one would have played a fugue in a rubato manner in the Baroque era, and certainly there's any number of modern interpreters of Baroque music who do that sort of thing. But in fact, the working title for this piece, before I gave it the name Different Worlds, was Romantic Fugue. But let's talk, other than how I played it, let's get a little more specific. So it's in F minor, and that opening passage, it has that leading tone there. Nothing at all jazzy about that. In fact, that first 5 notes is right. That's the Bach C minor fugue. I didn't do that on purpose. And nothing else about this reminds me of the Bach C minor fugue from Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. But nothing about this piece in general reminds me of that fugue, but there's no getting around the fact that that very opening passage is that, transposed to F minor. All right, but let's take a look at this measure here. That use of that chromatic passing tone, that B natural on the way down, not unheard of in itself. Bach would put in some chromatic. He definitely did fugues that had, chromaticism in it. He kind of loved those chromatic fugues, in fact. But the combination of that with also that chromatic neighbor tone here, there's something, a little jazzy about that, perhaps. The next measure, though, that much more so. This, in jazz terms, that is an enclosure. And yeah, in classical terms, we could talk about cambiata, changing tone, double appoggiaturas, all these terminology for similar types of figures that occasionally happen. But I will tell you, it doesn't sound like any of those things to me. It sounds like a jazz enclosure to me. So, and frankly, I'm sure that is what I had in mind when I wrote it, even though that was 14 years ago, and I don't remember the circumstances of it that much. One thing I do remember is I wrote that line very freely, more freely even than I just played it, to the point where I didn't even know what time signature it was in when I was sort of working out that line. I didn't know where the downbeats were. It was sort of a sequence of notes to be interpreted very freely, and I only gradually discovered that, no, this is actually lays out very well in 3. All right, so some jazzy elements there. Next, I'm going to play the entrance of the second voice, which is very typical. It's at the dominant. So if it's in F minor for the original statement, the answer starts off on C. Now, does it start in C minor? Not right away. This is another really typical Baroque thing. Let's move it up to C, but not have that sound like we're in the key of C yet. I work my way to C minor over the course of three measures. So let's check that out. All right. So I start with that, C7 chord into F minor, but at some point I am, right? By the time I get around here, I am very much in C minor. Okay, so that's all the classical stuff around it. What's going on that makes this jazzy? Well, first of all, there's nothing new happening here, but those things that I did before, those little chromatic passing tones and those little things, they take on added meaning when we hear the way I have accompanied them in, I could call it a counter subject, but I don't actually use this. I don't use that line again, so it's not technically a counter subject in those terms. It's just what the first voice does underneath the answer. Anyhow, but check out some of those things that I had talked about, that use of the chromaticism here. This line, that was this, right? That line here is this line here. And yes, there's a leap in it. Instead of stepping down chromatically, I have it leap up. Not a jazz thing specifically there. That's a very typical device to have those octave displacements in there. But there is something about it that does feel kind of jazzy in this context, especially because this, the way it works out harmonically, I'm in the key of E flat. That F sharp kind of comes as a surprise. And then this chord here, this is a jazz chord, right? This is A flat 7 with a sharp 11. And yes, we can look at it in classical terms and say, oh, that is a French augmented sixth chord, not a Bach thing, right? A Beethoven thing? Yeah, but not so much a Bach thing to have French augmented sixth chords. So that sound is very much a jazz sound. Then, going into here. We get that much more of that. There's that enclosure, and the chromatic approach that I have in that accompaniment really kind of accentuates that amount of chromaticism to really make it feel that much more jazzy. And then just to kind of finish out the exposition of this fugue, here's the third voice entering now on top in the original key. All right, so here, I'm introducing lots of little extra bits of, it's the top voice that has the subject. Whoops. Right? Top voice has the subject, but I'm introducing, and then I'm introducing that little motif there just to give it some variety. Not a jazz thing, but worth pointing out. So what's going on in here that adds some jazz elements? Well, the fact that I'm using a chromatic neighbor tone here. I'm in F minor, but I'm allowing there to be an A natural here, even though I'm in F minor. Is it exclusively a jazz thing to have a chromatic lower neighbor? No, but it's consistent with it. This next measure that sound that I'm creating here, this is G7 sus flat 9. Man, that is a jazz chord if there was ever a jazz chord. You could talk about, well, classical composers use suspensions all the time. They use flat 9 sometimes, but that combination is just such a jazzism. And then, again, with the little bit of chromatic, here it's just the leading tone, so it's not unexpected, but still, it's consistent with a jazz approach. And then, again, this B natural, that bit of chromaticism, that's that same passing tone that was this measure, right? It was just that measure, but with that leap up. Just, big dramatic leaps are more of a jazz thing. They're a Baroque thing too, for sure, but it's also a jazz thing. And that B natural kind of makes this into a B flat 7, flat 9 chord. Yeah, kind of a jazzy thing. And then we have a double neighbor tone that are both chromatic, right? I don't know, that's like the jazziest thing in the whole piece, perhaps, is just the way that lower neighbor figure works. And I think that might be about it. Here, that enclosure figure actually is the least jazzy version of that enclosure figure, because in this case, the G flat is a chord tone. This is A flat 7. The G flat is a chord tone. The E natural is the ringer, right? It's because this is basically an A flat 7 chord going into D flat. So the E natural is our chromatic adjustment. The other places where we had that enclosure figure, it was the first note, the upper note, that was the non-chord tone, and then the lower note was the chord tone, and same when it occurred. Well, I guess here you can't really say, but to me this is pretty clearly a C7 chord with a G flat as the non-chord tone. So it's non-chord tone, chord tone, the first two times it shows up, but here it's chord tone, non-chord tone. Not specifically jazz, but maybe interesting. And again, we get that sus flat 9 chord there at the end of the exposition, resolving to an F minor chord at the end of it. And then, I introduce some improvisation, and I do some other passages where I've got some stretto going. I'll just play a little bit of that for you because it's fun. Improvising around there. So I've written out passages that are notated, and then passages that I can improvise with and intersperse. And yes, there's a whole kind of extended solo section where I can just improvise for a while, but the way I'm incorporating both notated passages and improvised passages and kind of integrating them, that's another jazz element that I'm introducing here. And if this is now dependent on the player, but if the player approaches it correctly or the way I'm intending, it will feel all of a thing. It won't feel like someone's, oh, here's the classical part and here's the jazz part. It'll all feel kind of blended together nicely. That is at least the goal I have with this piece. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this little look through this piece of mine that combines the different worlds of classical and jazz.